Hello. In this tutorial we're going to continue to expand our game by adding an animated explosion. So right now we have the ability to launch missiles and the missiles can collide with the enemy ships, and we detect that collision and we remove the missile and the enemy ship from the game world, the lists that we're maintaining, but there's no visual effect going on right now. I mean, we are playing the audio when the collision occurs, but what we'd like to do is add a visual representation of this explosion and have that explosion expand out and kind of show this cloud of fire. So the way that we're going to do that is by using what's called a sprite sheet. And a sprite sheet is just simply a simple texture, but it consists of multiple sprites or multiple different images. And you can see here that we have an image that has 12 cells wide. So it starts off with this small plume and it grows bigger, and it maximizes here at about the 6th or 7th cell, and then it grows smaller and more transparent over time. Now what we're going to do with this is load this single graphic in, and then we're going to show pieces of the graphic, not the entire graphic, but I want to use this one small piece, and then a couple of milliseconds later I'll show this piece, and then I'll show this third piece, and fourth, and so on. And it'll look like an animation is going on. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to load this texture in, this explosion sheet PNG file, and then we're going to make use of it as an asset. We're going to create an explosion class that will manage which of these different cells it should be showing at a given time, and then ultimately what it'll do is animate through those and then disappear from our world. We'll use this explosion class and create a new instance of the explosion class whenever one of these collisions occurs between a missile and an enemy, and then we'll have a nice visual representation that'll go along with that explosion sound that we're playing. Now you'll notice that this graphic that we're looking at here is 1680 pixels by 134 pixels. And you'll notice that if we divide 1608 by 12, we get 134. So each one of these cells that we have is going to be 134 pixels wide by 134 pixels tall. And we will just show the different pieces of them. Okay, so we'll go ahead and close this, and we can look at the explosion sheet PNG. We need to bring that and copy it into our assets folder of our project, and then now we have that explosion sheet PNG. We need to come into the PlayStation Mobile Studio and right click on our assets folder, and let's add that existing file. So let's pull in the explosion sheet PNG, and now we have that as part of our assets. You're going to want to make sure that that is set to be content in the build action, and for all graphics files that should be the default, so we're good there. And now what we need to do is define an explosion class and then create one of those instances of the explosion class, or an object of the explosion class, here whenever we have a collision. So right now you'll notice we're marking the missile and the enemy is alive to be false, and we're playing the explosion. And what I'd like to do right here at this part of my code is add an object of the explosion class, but we don't have that defined yet. So let's go ahead and create a new class and call it explosion next. Okay, the easiest thing that we can do is take our missile class that we have here, and let's right click on that and select copy. And then in my main Star Shooter project I want to right click and say that I want to paste. So that's going to create a copy of the missile. Let's rename this. So just hit F2. Let's call it explosion. And let's open up the explosion class and edit that now. We need to rename it, obviously. It's not public class missile, it should be explosion. And I'll rename the constructor here to match, because the explosion class is going to do a lot of what the missile class did. Okay. Now the explosion is not moving, so we don't need this private int speed. And we don't need to track the extents of the explosion, so we don't need to know what the dimensions of the explosions are, because we're not going to do any kind of collision detection on that. And here, the asset that I want to load is not the missile.png, but it's the explosion sheet. So point the asset that you're loading for that texture 2D to be the explosion underscore sheet.png, and that's that file that we just brought in into our assets folder here. Okay, since we don't have a speed, we can go ahead and delete that in the constructor. We don't need to do that. And the update method is going to be a little bit different because we're not moving this missile through the screen, the work that we want to do with update is going to be to update the active cell of the sprite sheet. So we're going to show a different cell as the explosion is alive. It's going to animate itself by changing which of the active frames or the active cells is being shown. Now we're going to keep track of time inside of our explosion by passing into the update method how long time has passed since the update method was last run. So we're going to take in elapsed time here as a parameter, and then we need to maintain a local time inside of the class. So inside of the explosion class here, I want to create a private long frame time, and I'm going to increment this by the elapsed time, and that's going to help me know how much time has passed. And then, very similar to knowing whether the player should be able to shoot, I'm going to track how much time has passed and see whether it's time to update which of the cells is active or which piece of this sprite should be displayed by keeping track of this frame time. So I want to say that frame time is going to increase by the elapsed time, and then I can check to see if the frame time is greater than or equal to the frame duration, or how long do I want each frame to show. So let's use all caps frame duration, and I haven't defined this yet, but I can use an all caps as an indication that I have a constant or a variable that's not going to change. So I'm going to define this constant, and then I'll be able to use it here later. So there's only one place that I'll have to actually modify it. So let's define that constant up here inside of the class itself. It's going to be a private, and we've got a keyword const, which means this isn't a variable. It's got a value, and I can use it like a variable, but I can only read from it. I can never change it. I can never write to it. So it's going to be constant, and it's going to be the same. So we'll use an integer here, and I'll call this frame duration, because that's what I'll use later. And I'll go ahead and say I want each of these frames to show for 50 milliseconds, or 1/20th of a second. And we could adjust this to elongate the explosion time, but for now let's just create the frame duration to be 50 milliseconds. And then down here, if the frame duration has been exceeded, meaning enough time has passed or more than 50 milliseconds has passed, then I want to update and change which frame is currently active. So I'd like to maintain this notion of active frame and advance that frame to say, okay, enough time has passed and you should be looking at a new frame, and make sure that a different part of that overall sprite sheet is being displayed. All right, we don't have this active frame variable yet, so let's go ahead and define that here. All right, that is a variable. And this is going to go between 0 and 11. So when active frame is 0, that means I'm going to paint that leftmost piece of my overall sprite sheet. And when active frame is 1, I'm going to go off and paint the next piece of it. And of course, inside of the constructor here, we're going to want to set the active frame initially equal to 0, so that we're going to start there on that left-hand piece of that graphic. I'm going to establish a new constant here. So similar to what we did with the frame duration, I'm going to establish a frame max, and that's going to tell me what's the maximum number of the frame that I'd like to show. In this case, I want to go between 0 and 11, so I want to iterate and say which of the active frames is current, and I want that to range between 0 and 11, so that when the active frame is greater than frame max, I know that I've played out all of these cells and I've shown them all, and that means that I am done and I shouldn't do any more animation. Okay, so back down here, once I've established that frame max const, right, inside of my update method, I'm going to advance the active frame, and I'll need to reset the frame time to be equal to 0, meaning, okay, now that I have advanced the active frame by 1, I want to reset my timer and wait another 50 milliseconds. So I'll set frame time to be equal to 0. But I also want to set to see if the active frame is greater than the frame max. And if that's the case, I want to mark this animation, this explosion, to be no longer active. I'm going to set isAlive to be false, meaning I've played everything out. I have displayed all of these animations, and now it's time for this explosion to go away. I'm getting pretty close to being done with this explosion class, but there's one more change that I need to make, and that is I want to make sure that the sprite that I'm rendering is only a piece of the overall sprite, not the whole thing. Now remember, we have a large, wide sprite, but we don't want all of it. We only want these individual cells to be 134 by 134, and that's what I'd like to paint. So I'm going to create a new constant, private const int frame cell size, and I'm going to set that to be 134, and that's going to tell me the height and the width of my frame, the cell that I'd like to actually show. So each one of these different pieces, I don't want the entire graphic to be displayed out of this explosion sheet. I want pieces that are 134 by 134 to be displayed. Now I need the ability to draw only a piece of the sprite. Right here in my render, I'm telling the entire sprite to display itself, and I need to modify that. And I can do that by using the setTextureChords function of the sprite class. And notice that I can pass it a vector, which is the top left and the bottom right, or I can pass it these 4 parameters to denote the upper left and bottom right that I'd like to display. Now I know the piece that I'd like to display based on the active frame. So if I take the frame cell size and I multiply that by the active frame, that's going to move me to the left based on which frame is active. So when active frame is 0, it's going to do this multiplication and the left coordinate is going to be 0. But when active frame is 1, and that means I want to display the next area, not that leftmost area, then I'm going to move over to the 134th spot, and I'll move over exactly as wide as I need because that frame cell size is 134. If I was trying to display the 10th cell in this sprite sheet, then I would multiply, active frame would be 10, and I would multiply 10 by that frame cell size, and I would start over there at position, in this case, 1340. So by doing this multiplication like this, it's going to move me to the left as wide as I need. Okay, I always want to start at the top because we're not needing to, adjust the vertical position of where I'm painting. So I'm going to always have my y coordinate at 0, and the 4th parameter of this is how far to the left should I paint. In that case, it's the frame width, the frame cell size, multiplied by active frame plus 1, meaning I want something that is, in this case, 134 wide, and that's going to give that to me. But make sure we subtract off 1 because I don't want to draw that next column of graphics. I want only, in this case, 0 to 133, or I'd want to start at 134 and go exactly 1 column less than where I would begin at the next time. Okay, and then I'm going to look at the height of my sprite and subtract 1 off of that. So that's going to give me the both horizontal and vertical position of how much of this overall sprite do I want. So by using the set texture coordinate, I'm saying I don't want the entire texture to be painted, I only want a small piece of it painted, and I'm defining the upper left and lower right of the piece. Okay, we're almost done then with this explosion, and the last thing I need to do is to be able to set the height and the width of the sprite. So I'd like to be able to say that the height of the sprite is equal to this constant frame cell size, and I'd like to set the width to be equal to the frame size as well. So that way my height and my width are going to be defined, and then I'll be able to only draw a piece of it, not the entire thing. Now if you compile this, you'll see that we're getting 2 errors here, because the height and the width have the ability to read, but they say they can't be assigned to. So let's go into our sprite class here, and let's look at the code for that height and that width. Okay, so you'll notice that we have get accessors here for the height and the width that are going to return the values, and that's fine if I'm reading from them. But in this particular case, I'm actually doing an assignment, and I'm trying to take this value and place it into that height and width, and that's not permitted right now because in my sprite, I only have the get. Now we can also allow someone to write a value to the property, in this case width and height, by using the set keyword. And set is going to look very similar to the get, but it's going to say, okay, what do you want to do with this value that you're passing in? And in this particular case, I'd like to set this private width here that we have to be equal to whatever the value that's coming in. So the code here is going to allow me to now update the width, lowercase w width, which is private here, by the value that is being passed in when you do this assignment. And I can do the same thing with the height by assigning the value that's coming in using this set command. Now you notice that value is highlighted blue because this is a keyword to C#, and it's going to say, what are you trying to write into when you assign something to this, in this case, capital W width, this property, and it's going to take whatever the user is passing into this, and it's going to use that in this particular case to assign into this private lowercase w width. Okay, so back into Explosion, if we were to compile this now and build it, then the error goes away because the height and the width are now writable because I have that set. So to review, we talked about the get accessor before, where I can give read access and someone can read the value of this variable. And now using the set command, I can make this property writable or changeable by taking in this value and doing whatever code that I'd like to with it there. So let's review what we've done with the explosion. First, we copied the missile class and then changed a couple of things to make it the explosion class here. We didn't need any kind of speed, but we did need this frame time to count how long has passed since I painted or updated the last frame. What is the active frame? And this is going to go between 0 and 11. I've used some constants here to figure out how long should each frame be displayed, how many frames there are, and how wide and how tall each of these frames are. In my constructor, I initialize the active frame to be 0 so that I'll start painting that leftmost frame. And of course, I updated which of these graphics I was using as far as the texture goes. Since this is a sprite sheet, I don't want to paint the entire sprite. I'd like to paint a piece of it. And so we use the set texture coordinates and gave the upper left and lower right bounds, or what piece of this overall graphic would I like to display. And in my update, I'm going to update this frame time by how much time has passed by this parameter. And whenever frame time is large enough, in this case 50 milliseconds, I'm going to advance to the next frame, reset my frame time so that I'm counting up again, and if my active frame is greater than the maximum, then I want to set that this explosion should no longer be active and it will be removed from the list of active explosions that we have in our main game. So now we've actually got the explosion finished. Let's go into the app main and add them in whenever a collision occurs. So here in this check for collisions, remember we iterated across all the missiles and enemies, and if they overlapped in their rectangular bounds, I played this sound player for the explosion, and I marked the missile and the enemy that collided to be inactive. And now I'd like to create a new explosion. So let's just create a new explosion. I'll call this explosion EXP, and I'll set EXP to be equal to a new explosion. Notice that it is expecting 3 parameters: the graphics context in which it lives, and the X and Y of where the explosion should occur. Now in this case, I can look at the enemies collection at this position that the enemy that's dying exists. So I'll pass it the enemies of E.X and then the enemies of E.Y, and that will tell me the exact XY position of the enemy. So now we'll get an explosion wherever that enemy lived. This is the enemy that we just marked that should go away. Now if we were to compile this right now and build it, we're going to get an error in that the best overloaded method for the constructor for explosion is actually expecting a integer, and the X and the Y position for the enemy is going to be marked as a floating point value. So I can typecast this and make the parameter that I'm passing in to my constructor for the explosion to actually be an integer. Now remember, the typecast, we just use the type and we specify that inside of these parentheses, and then that's going to take whatever value that's here, in this particular case the enemies of E.X, and it's going to force that in from a float into an integer. Okay, now if we were to build this, It's going to work just fine, and we'll get a new explosion, and it will be created at that XY position. But I don't necessarily want just one explosion, and I'd like to be able to manage a collection of these so that they're all drawn. I can have multiple explosions occur, right? Perhaps I'm shooting multiple enemies at a time. And so I'd like to create an explosions collection. So let's say explosions.add exp. And you can say, well, I'm getting an error here because the explosions collection doesn't exist. So let's create a new list of explosions, just like we have for our missiles and our enemies. We can add that up here as a private static list of explosion, and we'll call it explosions. And then in here in the constructor, I'll need to be sure to set the explosions to be a new list of explosion. Now, when we have a collision, we can just tell the explosions to add that new explosion that I created. Alternatively, I could have skipped creating this temporary variable exp, and I could have just told the explosions to add a new explosion. So I could have taken this code that I had here and place it directly inside the add method, right? So now I can remove this exp variable and just say my explosions collection, I want to add this new explosion, and it should be positioned at this XY spot. And then that will work by creating a new explosion and adding it into that explosions collection. Now I just need to update my render and my update method from my main game to display and to process each of these explosions in the collection. So we'll do that next. So let's do the update method, or sorry, let's do the render method because that'll actually be the easiest here. So let's go down to my render function, and just like we did for each of our enemies and our missiles, let's do for each explosion E in explosions, that's my collection. I want to say E.render and tell each of the explosions to render themselves on the screen. Okay, now that we have render working, let's go to the update function and make sure that we're handling all of the explosions. So I'm going to write a new function called handle explosions. If I can spell it right. So there we go, handle explosion, handle explosions. And let's write that now. It's going to be a private static void function, handle explosions. And the code for this is going to be such that I want to iterate across all of them, right? So let's do for int I equals 0. Let's go from the beginning here, right? I want to see if there are any that are inactive, right? Marked as is alive to be false, and then I want to remove them. So I could write a loop here that just calls the update function on each one, but what I'm going to do instead is start from the end, right? Explosions.count -1, and so long as I is greater than or equal to 0, I'm going to keep going and then decrease I each time. And the work I'd like to do through this, I'm going to start at the end of the explosions collection and then go to the beginning and say, look, is the explosions at position I is alive equal to false? And if it is, that means I need to remove this, right? So explosions.remove at, you've seen this before, at position I. I want to get rid of it from my explosions collection because I don't need it anymore. But otherwise, if the explosion is not marked as is alive false, meaning the explosion is still alive, I can use this else clause. So we've seen the if, and if this statement was true, I want to run this code. But what about if the statement was false? It could be that I'd like to run something different if that statement is false, and I can use the else keyword here to say, if this is true, run this, otherwise, or else, run this other code. And I want to say explosion sub I dot update. So if it's not dead, then make sure it updates itself. And remember, my update function for the explosion class expected the elapsed time that's transpired, and we have that as time delta here. So I'm going to pass time delta as how much time has gone by since the last time we've done update, and it will increase its time counter for that frame, and as soon as it's enough, it's going to update that frame and display a different frame as necessary. So we're going to iterate across all of the explosions here, starting from the end and going to the beginning. If the isAlive is false, that means that this explosion should not exist anymore, and we're going to remove it from the explosions collection. Otherwise, if isAlive is true, that means the explosion is active, and we should update that explosion by calling its update function and letting it update its local time that it's counting for that frame, and then displaying a different frame and making active frame advance. So at this point, we're ready to run. So let's hit F5. And if I shoot here, you'll see we have a very nice animated explosion. And you can see the sprite sheet is advancing there. And we still have our sound that's being played. So the way this is working, just to kind of remind you, is we have the explosion class, and it's maintaining which frame is active, and it is displaying a different piece of this overall explosion sprite sheet. So as you saw me run that, you should have seen this first graphic displayed, and then after about 50 milliseconds, it's going to show a different version of this. We can speed up or slow down our explosion by adjusting this frame duration. So if I wanted it very, very slow, I could say every half second update the frame that's displayed and change the frame duration to be much, much larger. And now if I run this, what we'll see is if I make a shot, you can see that that sprite sheet is going very, very slow, and every half second we see a new piece of that. All right, so that's a bit excessive, so something around 50 milliseconds or 20 frames a second is probably appropriate there. Okay, to review what we've done, we defined this explosion class to have the notion of active frame, which of these frames we wanted to see in this overall sprite sheet. And remember that the explosion sprite sheet contains 12 different frames. You can get animation of someone walking just by displaying a different pose and iterating across as that time advances for that particular object. We also maintained this frame time so that later in the update we could see has enough time passed, and if so, advance that active frame by one. If we had exceeded the maximum number of frames, an active frame became greater than frame max, then I'm going to mark this explosion isAlive to be false, and then I'll know to not render it anymore and remove it from my explosions collection. The render was changed slightly here for this particular class because I want to use the set texture coordinates and specify the upper left and lower right portion of the overall texture that I'd like to paint. So I'm not rendering the entire texture, I'm just rendering a piece of it. In my app main, if we scroll back to that, right, we had the handle explosions function that's going to iterate across all the explosions and check to see if any of them need to be removed, and also to update them based on the time change if they are still active. And down here in the explosion check for collisions, I'm going to create a new explosion and add it into my explosions list that we created up here at the top. Right, the list of explosion is going to handle that entire collection of any explosions that are active on the screen. And that's how you can get animations and using a sprite sheet to create this cell-based animation in your game.